everyone. In this video, I will talk about the daily routine of my friend Alan. Monday at 9 o'clock, he wakes up and makes his breakfast. At 10 o'clock, he cleans up his bedroom and has breakfast. At 12 uh, o'clock, he heads in the class of industrial operations. At 3 p.m., he goes to the library. At 4 p.m., he talks and plays with his friend. At 6 o'clock, he leaves to the university. At 8 o'clock, he arrives home and has lunch. At 9 p.m., he goes to his bedroom, undresses, and makes his dinner. At 10 p.m., he eats his dinner and watches some TV. At 11 p.m., he goes back to his bedroom and plays. And 12 o'clock, he goes to sleep. On Tuesday at 8 p.m. a.m., he wakes up and turns off his alarm. At 9 o'clock, he takes his sister to school and catches the bus. At 10 a.m., he enters the university. At 11 o'clock, he pays attention to his class. At 12 p.m., he writes his last notes and leaves the class. At 1 o'clock, he goes to the library to advance some homeworks. At 2 p.m., he enters the planning and operation class. At 3 p.m., he talks with homies. At 4 o'clock, he leaves the class and goes to the library. At 5 p.m., he plays and talks about his day with his partners. At 6 o'clock, he leaves the university. At 8 o'clock, he arrives home and has lunch. At 9 p.m., he goes to his bedroom, undresses, and makes his dinner. At 10 o'clock, he plays with his homies. At 11 o'clock, he talks about what has been in their lives. At 12 o'clock, he goes to sleep. Wednesday, at 8 o'clock, he wakes up, turns off his alarm, and waits a light. At 9 a.m., he makes and eats his breakfast and takes a shower. At 10 a.m., he heads reset for university, takes the bus and leaves. At 11 a.m., he enters his differential equations class. At 12 p.m., he buys and eats breakfast. At 1 p.m., he takes notes. At 2 o'clock, he leaves the class and goes to the library. At 3 o'clock, he goes to the laboratory for experiments. At 4 o'clock, he leaves the laboratory and goes to the library. At 5 p.m., he works ahead on some homework. At 7 p.m., he leaves the university and takes the bus. At 8 p.m., he arrives home and has lunch. At 9 o'clock, he does homework in the living room. At 12 o'clock, He cleans up his bedroom like while talking with his girlfriend. At 1 a.m., he goes to sleep. Thursday, at 8 a.m., he wakes up and turns off his alarm. At 9 a.m., he takes his sister to school and catches the bus. At 10 o'clock, he enters the class. At 11 o'clock, he takes notes. At 12 o'clock, he leaves the class and goes to eat outside. At 1 p.m., he goes to the library and plays. At 2 o'clock, he arrives at the next class. At 3 o'clock, he takes notes. At 4 p.m., he leaves the class and returns to the library. At 5 p.m., he plays and talks with his friend. At 6 p.m., he leaves the university. At 8 o'clock, he arrives home and has lunch. At 9 o'clock, he goes to his bedroom and does homework. At 10 p.m., he talks with his girlfriend a lot. At 11 p.m., he cleans up his bedroom a light. And finally, 1 o'clock, 1 a.m., he goes to sleep. On Friday, 8 o'clock, he wakes up and gets dressed. At 9 a.m., he goes to the kitchen and makes his breakfast. At 10, he eats his breakfast and goes to work. At 11 a.m., he arrives at work. At 12 p.m., he heads the tools and does his work. At 2 p.m., he goes home to eat his lunch. At 3 p.m., he returns to work and does his job. At 5 o'clock, he talks a lot with his friend. At 6 o'clock, he leaves work and walks home. At 7 o'clock, he arrives at his house. At 8 o'clock, he makes and eats his dinner. At 9 p.m., he plays video games. And finally, 1 a.m., he goes to sleep.